He was born under a death sentence, hidden in a basket, raised inside the palace of the very king who wanted him dead. But years later, this same child would stand before Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." This is the incredible story of Moses. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for generations, but a new Pharaoh rose to power. He looked at the Israelites and became afraid of them because they had grown into a great multitude. So Pharaoh enslaved them. He forced them to build cities and work under harsh conditions. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied. Then Pharaoh made a terrifying command. Every Hebrew boy who was born was to be thrown into the Nile. Imagine the fear inside every Hebrew home. Every newborn son was now in danger. And then, a baby boy was born into one family. His name was Moses. Moses' mother saw that he was a beautiful child. For 3 months she hid him, but eventually she could hide him no longer. So she made a small basket from reeds. She covered it carefully with tar and pitch so that water could not enter. Then she placed her baby inside. She carried him to the Nile and placed the basket among the reeds. Moses' older sister Miriam stood at a distance, watching. She didn't know what would happen. Would someone find him? Would he survive? Then, Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river. She saw the basket, she opened it, and there was the crying baby. She immediately knew he was one of the Hebrew children, but instead of killing him, she had compassion on him. Miriam stepped forward and asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and Miriam brought Moses' own mother. Think about that. The woman who had feared losing her baby was now being paid to raise him. God had turned a hopeless situation into a miracle. When Moses grew older, he was brought to Pharaoh's daughter, and she adopted him as her son. She called his name Moses because she had drawn him out of the water. The child who should have been killed by Pharaoh was now growing up inside Pharaoh's own palace. Moses grew up surrounded by Egyptian wealth and power, but he never forgot that he was a Hebrew. One day Moses went out and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looked around. Then he struck the Egyptian and killed him. Moses thought no one had seen what he had done, but Pharaoh eventually heard about it, and Moses became afraid. Pharaoh wanted him dead, so Moses ran. He left Egypt behind and escaped to the land of Midian. The prince of Egypt had become a fugitive. In Midian, Moses began a completely different life. He married Zipporah. He became a shepherd. The man who had once lived in a palace was now spending his days leading sheep through the wilderness. Years passed, then one day, Moses led the flock toward Mount Horeb, and there, something caught his attention. A bush was burning, but the bush was not being consumed. Moses moved closer. Then he heard a voice. "Moses, Moses!" He answered, "Here I am." God told him not to come any closer. He was standing on holy ground. Then God revealed why he had called him. God had heard the cries of his people in Egypt, and he was sending Moses back to Pharaoh. But Moses was afraid. He asked, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" God answered, "I will certainly be with you." Moses still hesitated. He worried that the Israelites would not believe him. Then he asked God what he should say if they asked for God's name. God answered, "I am who I am." God told Moses to go to the Israelites and tell them that I am had sent him. But Moses still had another excuse. He said, "I am not eloquent." In other words, "I don't speak well enough." God responded, "Who has made man's mouth?" And finally, God appointed Aaron, Moses' brother, to speak alongside him. Moses could no longer hide behind his excuses. It was time to return to Egypt. Moses returned to Egypt. He and Aaron stood before Pharaoh, and they delivered God's message, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh laughed at the command. He refused. Instead, he made the Israelites work even harder. Moses returned to God, and then Egypt began to experience something it had never seen before. God sent plague after plague. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs covered the land. Gnats filled the air. Flies came, livestock died, boils covered the people, hail destroyed crops, locusts consumed what remained. Then darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. Still, Pharaoh refused to surrender. Then God announced the final plague. The firstborn throughout Egypt would die. But God gave the Israelites instructions for protection. They were to sacrifice a lamb and place its blood on the doorposts of their houses. When the destroyer passed through Egypt, the houses marked by the blood would be passed over. That night, Egypt was filled with mourning. Pharaoh's own firstborn son died. Finally, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. He told them to leave. The Israelites were free. After generations of slavery, they were finally going home. But the story wasn't over. The Israelites reached the Red Sea. Then they heard something terrifying. Pharaoh had changed his mind. His army was coming after them. The Israelites looked ahead. The sea was in front of them. Pharaoh's army was behind them. There seemed to be no escape. The people cried out to Moses, but Moses told them, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Then God commanded Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea. Moses raised his hand, and the waters began to move. The sea divided. Walls of water rose on both sides, and the Israelites walked through on dry ground. The Egyptian army followed. But when the Israelites had crossed safely, Moses stretched his hand over the sea again. The waters returned, and Pharaoh's army was overwhelmed. Israel had escaped Egypt. God had made a way where there seemed to be no way. The Israelites began their journey through the wilderness, but the wilderness was difficult. They became hungry. They became thirsty. They complained. Yet God did not abandon them. He provided manna from heaven. He gave them quail. When they needed water, God provided water from a rock. A pillar of cloud guided them during the day. A pillar of fire guided them at night. The same God who had brought them out of Egypt was now leading them toward the promised land. Then Moses climbed Mount Sinai. God called him to receive his commandments. On the mountain, God gave Moses his law. Among the commandments were, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. And honor your father and your mother." God wrote the commandments on stone tablets. But while Moses was on the mountain, the people became impatient. They made a golden calf and worshipped it. When Moses came down and saw what they had done, he was furious. He threw the tablets down and broke them. For 40 years, Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness, but leading God's people was not easy. There were arguments, there was rebellion, there was fear, there was unbelief, and eventually, Moses himself made a serious mistake. At Meribah, the people needed water. God instructed Moses to speak to the rock, but Moses, frustrated with the people, struck the rock with his staff. Water still came out. But Moses had disobeyed God's command. Because of this, God told Moses that he would see the promised land, but he would not enter it. Imagine carrying a nation through the wilderness for decades, only to stand at the edge of the destination and not enter. Moses' journey was coming to an end. He climbed Mount Nebo. From the mountain, God showed him the promised land. Moses could see the land, but he would not cross into it. He had spent his life leading God's people. Now another man would continue the mission. His name was Joshua. Moses blessed Joshua and prepared him to lead Israel. Then Moses died on the mountain. The Bible says that Moses was 120 years old when he died, and Israel mourned for him. The man who had once been a helpless baby in a basket had become the leader who confronted Pharaoh, crossed the Red Sea, received God's commandments, and led God's people through the wilderness. Moses' story teaches us something powerful. God can take someone from the most unlikely beginning and use that person for something greater than they could imagine. Moses was once afraid. He made excuses. He ran away. He doubted himself. But God still called him. So perhaps you're looking at your own life right now and thinking, I'm not qualified. I don't have enough. I'm too afraid. God can't use someone like me. Remember Moses. God does not always call the person who feels ready. Sometimes, he calls the person who simply has to trust him. The basket on the Nile was not the end of Moses' story. The wilderness was not the end. Pharaoh was not the end. Even the mistakes Moses made were not the end of God's purpose. Because when God has a purpose, he can make a way where there seems to be no way. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus 14:14. If this story encouraged you, don't just watch it and leave. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that God is still working, even when they cannot see the way forward. And remember, your current season is not necessarily the end of your story. God can still make a way.